He said it first at the edge of the creek where the cottonwoods were going gold, and the words came out of him the way a man drops a stone into still water, meaning only to see the ring, not to change the shape of the day. He said, "Whoever marries you will be lucky." And she looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the wind moved between them and did not move them. And then she leaned in and whispered, "I was hoping it would be you." That is where this story ends. But it is not where it began. Ethan Calloway was 31 years old that autumn, and he had lived every one of those years within 20 miles of the San Juan Range. His father had built the ranch house in 1859, back before Colorado was Colorado, back when the territory was only a name for the space between two rivers and a promise that could not be kept. Ethan's father was gone now, buried on the low rise above the north pasture, and his mother had followed the next spring, and Ethan had inherited 240 acres, 47 head of cattle, a broken-backed barn, and the particular loneliness of a man who has learned to speak to horses because the house no longer answered him. He was tall and lean and quiet, dark-haired with a week of dark stubble on his jaw, gray eyes that had learned to squint against the high plains sun and stayed that way indoors. He wore the same brown wool coat every autumn, patched at the elbows in a hand that was not his own, and a soft-brimmed hat that had once been black and was now the color of wet earth. He did not smile often. When he did, it was small and slow, as if he were checking to see whether he still remembered how. Clara Whitfield was 28, and she had come to the Calloway Ranch 3 years earlier under the plainest possible circumstance. Her older brother Samuel had been Ethan's foreman until a horse threw him against a fence post in April of 1878. And Samuel had lived 9 days after, and then he had not. And Clara, who had kept house for him in the small cabin at the north edge of the property, had stayed on. It was Ethan's mother, in the last months of her own life, who had asked Clara to stay, and Clara, who had nowhere else and no one else, had said yes. She had been 25 then. She was 28 now. And in 3 years, she had learned every board in the kitchen floor, and every creak in the porch step, and every place the wind found its way in through the north wall. And she had learned Ethan Calloway too, or thought she had, which is a different thing. She was slim and small-boned, with chestnut hair she kept braided down her back in a single, long rope, and hazel eyes that were more green in summer and more brown in winter, and a face that had been called plain by people who had not looked at it long. She wore a long-sleeved calico dress, pale blue with small white sprigs, buttoned to the throat, and a full-length dark brown wool skirt beneath a matching apron, and boots that had been resoled twice. Every stitch on her was modest and careful and covered, because she had been raised by a mother who had believed the body was a private thing and the soul was a public one. And Clara had never had reason to argue with either belief. They were not married. They had never spoken of it. In 3 years, she had cooked his breakfast and mended his coat and set his table and gone home each night to the small cabin at the north edge of the property. And he had ridden out at dawn and come back at dusk. And between them was a silence that could have been distance or could have been a room they were both afraid to enter. The town had opinions. The town always did. The town was Fairhaven, 42 miles south of Durango and 11 miles from the nearest railhead, and its opinions traveled by way of the Mercantile, which was run by a woman named Etta Bell, and by way of the church, which was pastored by a man named Reverend Hollis, and by way of the smithy, which was run by 2 brothers named Josiah and Wren Carver. And between the 4 of them there was very little in Fairhaven that was not known and repeated by nightfall. And what they knew by the September of 1881 was that Ethan Calloway had not looked at any other woman in 3 years, and that Clara Whitfield had not been courted by any other man in the same 3 years, and that a widower named Nathaniel Reeve had recently arrived from Pueblo with a small herd and a large opinion of himself, and had begun, quietly and correctly, and without malice, to call on Clara at the North Cabin on Tuesday afternoons. He was a good man. That was the trouble. Nathaniel Reeve was 36, tall, brown-bearded, warm-eyed, a widower of 4 years with 2 young sons back at his sister's house in Pueblo, and he had lost his first wife to fever and had grieved her honestly, and he had come to Fairhaven looking, as he said plainly to anyone who asked, for a good woman to make a home with, and I am not too proud to say so. He did not lie. He did not flatter. He brought Clara a paper twist of hard candy the first Tuesday, and a small tin of tea the second, and on the third Tuesday he sat on the porch of the North Cabin and told her, in the plainest words a man can find, that he thought she was the finest woman he had met in a year of looking, and that he would be honored if she would consider him. Clara did not answer him that Tuesday. She said she would think. And she did think. She thought about it for 4 weeks, and Ethan Calloway, who was not a fool, who had been raised on a ranch and knew how to read the ground and the sky and the small changes in a person's face, watched a wagon that was not his roll up to the North Cabin on a Tuesday, and again the next Tuesday, and again the next, and he said nothing. He said nothing at breakfast when Clara came in with color in her cheeks that was not the cold. He said nothing at supper when she set the plate down and her hand shook, just once, on the rim. He said nothing when he passed Nathaniel Reeve on the road into town, and Reeve tipped his hat with the easy grace of a man who has already decided he has won. Ethan said nothing because he did not know what to say, and because a man who has been silent for 3 years does not find his voice by shouting, and because he was afraid, in a way he could not have named, that if he spoke now, he would only make her go faster. Grief does that. Grief teaches a man to sit very still and hope that what he loves will not notice him and leave. The first time she saw the new gate, Clara did not know what she was looking at. It was a Wednesday morning in mid-September, and she was walking the 1/4 mile from the North Cabin to the main house with her basket. And she came to the crossbuck gate that opened onto the kitchen path, the one that had sagged on its lower hinge since the spring the horse had thrown Samuel, and she stopped because the gate was straight. The lower hinge was new. The wood had been planed and rehung, and the latch had been replaced with a Smith-forged one she recognized from Josiah Carver's shop. The dew was still heavy on the grass, and there were boot prints in the mud on both sides of the post, deep and set, the kind a man makes when he has knelt to work in one place for a long time. There was no note. There was no announcement. Ethan had ridden out at dawn, as he always did, but sometime in the night, or in the pale hour before dawn, he had knelt in the wet grass and mended the gate that had been broken for 3.5 years, and he had done it without a word to anyone. And Clara stood there for a full minute with her hand on the top rail and did not go inside until she had made her face plain again. That was the first one. There would be others. The next Tuesday, when Nathaniel Reeve's wagon rolled up the north road, Ethan Calloway was not at supper. He was in the small tool shed behind the barn, and he was building a window. He was building an east-facing window, single-paned, with a sash he had cut himself and a frame he had squared 4 times to be sure of it. And he was building it for the North Cabin, because the North Cabin had only one small window, and it faced west. And Clara had said once, 3 winters ago, in a passing sentence that no one else in the room had noticed, that she wished she could see the morning come in. He had not answered her then. He had said nothing, but he had remembered. He worked until the lantern guttered. Sawdust settled in the cuffs of his brown wool coat and clung there, and his palms were raw from planing, and he did not notice. When he finally walked back to the main house, it was past 10, and the kitchen was dark, and Clara had left him a plate of cold biscuits and a piece of ham under a folded cloth. He ate, standing up. He looked at the plate for a long time before he set it down. The town, meanwhile, was talking. Etta Bell was 54 and ran the mercantile with the particular efficiency of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and did not intend to bury a third. And she looked up over her spectacles one morning when Clara came in for flour and said, "Nathaniel Reeve is a fine man." Clara said, "Yes, ma'am, he is." Etta said, "And Ethan Calloway is a fine man." Clara said, "Yes, ma'am." And Etta said, "But only one of them has been sitting on your porch on Tuesdays, and only one of them has been fixing your fences at 4 in the morning. And I wonder if you have noticed which is which." Clara did not answer. She paid for the flour with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be, and she walked home the long way, past the creek, and she stood at the edge of the water for a while and watched a leaf ride the current down and out of sight. Reverend Hollis was 62 and had married the Calloways and buried them and knew Ethan the way a man knows the shape of a stone he has carried in his pocket for a lifetime. And he stopped Ethan on the church steps one Sunday and said only, "A good man will lose what he does not name." Ethan said, "Yes, sir." And Reverend Hollis said, "So name it." And Ethan tipped his hat and walked on. Wren Carver, the younger of the 2 Smiths, was 24 and blunt and had known Clara since they were children. And he came out of his shop one afternoon in October and stood in the road until Ethan's wagon had to stop. And he said, "You're going to let him have her." Ethan said, "That is not my decision, Wren." And Wren said, "It is exactly your decision, Ethan Calloway, and you are the only man in this county who does not know it." Wren spat once in the dust and added, quieter, "My mother waited on my father to find his tongue for 11 years. He never did find it. She married him anyway, and she cried on her wedding day. And I have never been sure whether it was because she got him or because she had waited so long. Do not do that to Clara." Josiah, the older brother, said nothing at all, because Josiah never said anything. But he had forged the new gate latch for free, and he had forged the sash lock for the east-facing window for free, and he had not sent Ethan a bill for either, and Ethan understood. They were the town chorus. They had been watching this story since the horse threw Samuel, and they had opinions, and their opinions were tender, and their opinions were correct. The second physical thing was the window. Clara found it on a Saturday morning in early October, and she found it not on the north cabin, where she had expected it, because Ethan had asked her, offhandedly, over a Tuesday breakfast, whether the north wall of the cabin was still drafty, and she had said it was, and she had assumed he meant to caulk it, but on the main house. On the small east-facing wall of the main house, in the room that had been his mother's sewing room, and had stood closed since her death. Ethan had cut a new window. The frame was fresh pine. The glass was clean. The morning light came through it in a pale gold column that landed on the floor exactly where his mother's chair had been. Clara stood in the doorway of that room for a very long time. He had not told her. He had not said, "This will be for you if you stay." He had simply built it, without announcement, in the shape of an offer she was free to accept or refuse, or never see at all. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. She did not speak of the window at breakfast. He did not speak of it either. But she began, that same week, to bring her sewing basket over from the north cabin in the afternoons, and to sit in the room with the east-facing window and mend his shirts there. And when he came in from the pasture at dusk, he could see the top of her head bent over her work from the kitchen doorway, and he would stand there for a moment, and then he would go and wash his hands. The third thing was harder to see, and it was the one that meant the most. Samuel Whitfield had been buried on the low rise above the north pasture beside Ethan's father and mother, because Ethan had insisted on it, and Clara had never been able to say thank you for that in a way that felt equal to the gift. In 3 years, she had walked up there twice a month, in every season, and she had knelt by her brother's stone and she had spoken to him. And each time she had brought a small handful of whatever the season had given her. A sprig of aspen leaf, a stem of dried grass, a single blue columbine in the summer. Her knees had grown accustomed to the cold ground. It was the one thing about the visits she had never said aloud, even to herself, that she was tired of kneeling, and that there had never been a place beside him to simply sit. That October, on a Thursday, she went up to the rise for her regular visit and found that someone had built a low wooden bench beside Samuel's grave. Not a fancy bench, a plain oak plank, planed smooth, on two round oak legs sunk into the earth, just wide enough for one person to sit on, just tall enough for the knees of a small-boned woman to rest comfortably. And on the underside of the seat, when she ran her fingers there, she felt letters, not carved deep, just scratched with a pocket knife, the way a boy carves initials into a schoolhouse desk, S.W. and a date, her brother's initials and the date of his death. She sat down on the bench. She sat on it for 2 hours. When she came down off the rise, it was near dusk, and Ethan was on the porch splitting kindling, and she walked up to him, and she did not say anything, and he did not stop splitting kindling. And after a minute he said, without looking up, "I should have done it 2 years ago." She said, "You did it when I needed it." And he split one more piece of kindling, and then he set the axe down, and he looked at her, and he said, "Clara." That was all he said, just her name, and she said, "Yes." And they stood there in the blue dusk with the smell of split pine between them, and the wind moved in the cottonwoods down by the creek, and neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke. And after a while she went inside to put supper on, and he went back to the kindling. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. That was the Thursday. The following Tuesday, Nathaniel Reeve came for his answer. He came at 3 in the afternoon, in a clean shirt, with his hat in his hand, and he sat on the porch of the north cabin, and Clara sat across from him, and he said plainly, as he always said things, "I would like to know your mind, Miss Whitfield." And Clara, who had been thinking about it for 4 weeks, and had been thinking about it, really, for 3 years, said, "Mr. Reeve, you are a good man." He said, "But," she said, "but I am not free to say yes to you." He said, "Are you promised to Ethan Calloway?" She said, "No, sir. He has not asked." Nathaniel Reeve was quiet for a long time. He looked out at the road. He looked at his hat. And then he said, and this was the good thing about him, the thing that made him hard to refuse and impossible to hate. "Miss Whitfield, may I say one honest thing?" she said. "Please." He said, "A man who has not asked in 3 years may not ask in 3 more, and you deserve to be asked. I would not stand in your way if he found his voice. But I would be a fool to leave without saying that I would not make you wait." He said it without heat. He said it without anger. He said it the way a man lays a cup down carefully on a table because he does not want to break it. And Clara felt the truth of it strike her, one clean blow, because she had asked herself the same question every Tuesday for a month. And she said, "I know, Mr. Reeve, I know that, and I am asking you for 1 more week." He looked at her. He nodded once. He said, "1 week, Miss Whitfield, and then, whichever way it goes, I will honor it." He paused with his hat still in his hand, and he added, quiet as a man closing a door on his own house for the last time, "But if you tell me next Tuesday that he has still not spoken, I will ask you again, and I will ask you well, and I will ask you to marry me before Christmas. I owe my own honesty that much." Then he stood up, and he put on his hat, and he walked to his wagon, and he drove out without looking back, because he was that kind of man, and because he understood, better than Ethan Calloway did in that moment, that a good man's dignity is the only thing he carries with him when he leaves. That was the friction. That was the cost. Nathaniel Reeve did not shout and did not sulk and did not lose his footing, but he made her name the thing. And he made her say the week out loud, and he laid down the exact size of the second question he would return with, so that she could not pretend it was smaller than it was. He gave her a week, and then he drove away, and Clara sat on the porch of the north cabin for a long time and did not cry, because she had not cried in 3 years and did not know how to begin now. That night, she did not eat. She lit a lamp in the north cabin, and she sat by the window that faced west, and she watched the light go down over the San Juan Range, and she thought about her brother, and she thought about the bench, and she thought about the east-facing window in the sewing room, and she thought about the gate. And she understood, sitting there, that she had been proposed to twice, once in words by a good man on a Tuesday afternoon, and once, over and over, in silence by a better one who did not know how to say it, and that she was going to have to be the one to speak first, because he never would. The next morning was a Wednesday. It was the 15th of October, 1881. The cottonwoods along the creek were at their full gold, and the air had the first bite of real autumn in it, and the light was low and long across the pasture. Ethan Calloway rode out at dawn, as he always did. Clara Whitfield walked down to the creek at 9 in the morning, alone, in her long calico dress and her heavy shawl, and she stood at the fence line where the pasture met the creek bank, at the place where the wire ran across the top of the low wall, and stopped at the corner post. And she waited. She waited an hour. She waited 2. Just past noon, Ethan came riding up along the creek line, checking the fence as he did every Wednesday, and he saw her from a quarter-mile away and pulled his horse up short. He sat there in the saddle for a full minute. Then he came on, slowly, and he swung down at the corner post, and he tied the horse, and he came over to the fence, and he stood on the other side of the top wire, with the creek behind him and the mountains beyond. And Clara stood on her side with the pasture behind her and the ranch house rising in the distance. And there were 3 strands of wire between them, and neither of them spoke. At last, Ethan said, "Is he coming Tuesday?" she said. "He asked me for my answer. I asked him for a week." Ethan looked down. He looked at the fence post. He looked at the wire. He looked at his own hand on the top rail. He said, "What are you going to tell him?" She said, "Ethan, I need you to tell me first." He said, "Tell you what?" She said, "You know what." He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved in the cottonwoods. A single yellow leaf came down off a branch and landed on the wire between them and stayed there. He said, "Clara, I am not a man who has ever been good at this. I am not a man who has words for it. I am a man who fixes fences." He said, "But if you tell me you're going to say yes to him, I will not stand in your way. I will not ask you to stay for me." She said, "I did not ask you what you would not do. I asked you what you would do." He said, "I would." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "I would spend every morning of my life building windows for the rooms you're going to sit in. I would spend every afternoon fixing the things that are broken between here and the north cabin. I would spend every evening on the porch of a house that was ours." He said, "But I am 3 years older than the day your brother died, and I am no better with words than I was then, and I do not have anything to offer you that is showier than a mended gate." He said, "Whoever marries you will be lucky." He said it looking at the leaf on the wire, not at her, and his voice was low, and it was not a proposal, because he was not a man who could say the word. It was only the truest sentence he had. He had said it once before, 3 years earlier, at Samuel's burial, standing beside her in his black coat with his hat in his hand, when he had turned to her at the graveside and said, quiet enough that only she could hear, Whoever marries you will be lucky, Clara Whitfield. She had not known what to say then. She had only nodded. Neither of them had spoken of it in the 3 years since, but she had never once forgotten the sentence, or the sound of his voice when he said it, or the way he had not looked at her afterward, as if the words had cost him more than he had known he had. Now he had said it again. And Clara Whitfield stood on her side of the fence with the pasture at her back and the cottonwoods going gold behind him, and she felt 3 years of silence rise up in her chest and become a single small breath. And she stepped forward until the top wire was at her waist, and she leaned across the strands of the fence, close enough that he could smell the lavender in the collar of her dress. And she looked up at him with her hazel eyes clear and her hands steady on the wire, and she whispered, "I was hoping it would be you." That was what she said, just that, 6 small words. He did not answer her in words. He put his hand over hers on the top wire, and they stood there, and the yellow leaf between them did not move. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early November, at the small church in Fairhaven by Reverend Hollis, who did not smile during the vows because he never did, but who nodded once, deeply, at the Amen. Nathaniel Reeve was not in the church, and this was correct, and everyone understood it, but he sent Clara a handwritten note that said only, "Miss Calloway, my honest wishes. N.R." And Clara kept the note in her Bible for the rest of her life. Etta Bell wept openly and said afterward, dabbing her eyes, that she had been right about most things in Fairhaven for 30 years, and she would like it noted that she had been right about this one too. Wren Carver, blunt and honest as ever, said on the church steps, "About damn time, Calloway." And Ethan tipped his hat, and Josiah Carver, who did not speak, put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and left it there for a full breath, which was, from Josiah, the whole of a speech. They lived on the ranch. She sat in the sewing room in the mornings, in the light of the east-facing window, and she mended his shirts, and she read her Bible. And once a week she went up to the rise and sat on the bench beside her brother and told him what the season was doing. In the winter of 1883, their first child was born, a girl whom they named Emma after Ethan's mother. In 1886, a son whom they named Samuel. In 1889, a second daughter, Ruth. The ranch grew. The herd grew. The barn was rebuilt, and the north cabin was renovated and rented to a young married couple new to the county. And the gate at the kitchen path did not sag again in Ethan Calloway's lifetime, because he checked it every Sunday for the rest of his years. They were married for 41 years. In the spring of 1922, Ethan Calloway was buried on the rise beside his parents and beside Samuel Whitfield, and Clara sat on the bench above his grave every Wednesday morning until her own end 4 years later. In her Bible, along with Nathaniel Reeve's note and a pressed columbine and a lock of her brother's hair, she kept a single yellow cottonwood leaf, which had been pressed flat and browned at the edges by time. She had never told anyone where it came from. She had not needed to. Her daughters, Emma and Ruth, found the leaf in the Bible after her funeral, and they did not know what it meant either, and they laid it back exactly where they had found it, between the pages of the book of Ruth, because some things a mother keeps are not for her children to explain, only to keep on keeping. That is the whole of the story. It is a small story. There is no shootout in it, and no gold, and no vengeance, and no ride at midnight. There is only a man who did not know how to speak, and a woman who waited 3 years to hear him try, and a fence between them, and a leaf on a wire, and the 6 small words that changed the whole shape of the years that followed. But this is the part I want you to carry with you tonight, wherever you are watching from, whether you are watching from a kitchen in Kansas, or a porch in Kentucky, or a small room in Australia, or a farmhouse in Ireland. And please, do tell me in the comments what country you are watching from. I read everyone. This is the part I want you to carry. If there is someone in your life who has been building the small, quiet things for you, the fixed gate and the east-facing window and the bench above the grave, and you have been waiting for them to say it in words, understand this. Sometimes the person who loves you the most is the person who does not know how to announce it. Sometimes the only way that love will ever reach you is if you are the one, standing at the fence line on a Wednesday morning in October, who says the first 6 words. Do not wait 3 years to say them. Do not wait 3 months. If you have already seen the window and the gate and the bench, then you have already been asked. All that is left is for you to answer. Thank you for spending this hour with me. Thank you for letting these people live in your kitchen for a little while, and in your heart, if they've earned a corner of it. If this story reached you, leave a small word below, 1 line, 1 sentence, whatever the story asked of you, and I will read it. Until next time, keep writing. And if you like this one, stay with me for the next. There is a story I've been holding back for a while, about a widower in the high country who buys the ranch next to a woman who has sworn she will never marry again. And about the winter they spend snowed in on adjoining land, and about the letter she writes and never sends and finds again the following spring. That one is called She Said, I Will Not Marry Again. And he answered, I am not asking yet. I'll be posting it next. Come back for it. I'll be right here.